Hello, this is Joseph Holbrook, and today we are talking about House of Spirits by Chilean author Isabel Allende. So let me go to my notes. We're going to talk today about the historical context of House of Spirits, the time period in which it was written, because there is a lot in this book about 1960s and 70s Chile, even going back to the 40s and 50s. So let's get started. The Chilean historical context for the House of Spirits by Isabel Allende. And I just threw some pictures in there because it's always nice to have beautiful pictures, right? Chile is a startling land. The Andes Mountains come very close up to the Pacific Ocean, and they're very severe in their altitude. Chile does not have a large number of indigenous people, but it does have some. So Isabel Allende was a Chilean writer who was forced to flee from Chile into the exile in Venezuela. I believe she was forced to flee around 1973 or 4, maybe 74. After the military coup in Chile. The book was first conceived by Allende when she received news that her 100-year-old grandfather was dying. She sat down to write him a letter. They loved each other dearly, even though he was extremely conservative and she was more on the liberal left side. Similar to some of the relationships you'll see in the book, House of Spirits. She began writing him a letter, but it turned into a chapter, then several chapters, and then a 600-page book called The House of Spirits. Her novel is heavily influenced by Gabriel Garcia Marquez's masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude, which we've already seen that book and talked about it. So it'll be interesting to make some comparisons as we go through this. She wrote it while living in Venezuela and published it in 1982. Chile has one of the most unusual geographies in the world. It's very long and very narrow, which is actually it's kind of hard to imagine what it would be like living in a country like that. It wouldn't be like an island because it's so long. Chile is an odd-shaped oddity. That is a redundancy. Sorry about that. I should have caught that. An accident of geography. The Andes Mountains that dominate most of the western part of South America run all the way down to the south of the continent, not far from the Pacific coast. Because this mountainous chain runs to elevations over 20,000 feet, it is nearly impossible and impassable, and effectively divides the narrow strip of land along the Pacific, known as Chile, from Argentina to the east. One of the great military feats in history was when General San Martin, the Argentine general, led his army over the Andes Mountains into Chile to liberate it from the Spanish. So Chile's geographic profile is most unique in the world. Here's a comparison of Chile. If it was superimposed over the geographical United States, it would go from the heart of Canada down to Mexico City. As I said, that's very long. One of the famous exports, Chilean exports, is wine. The unique topography makes it perfect for vineyards. So the Chilean wine has become very famous and is one of the countries made it the top 10 list of wine producers many times in the last few decades. The popularity of Chilean wine has been attributed not just to the quantity produced, but increasing levels of quality. The combination of quantity and quality allows Chile to export excellent wines at a reasonable prices to the international market. By the way, when I was Googling Chilean wines to find this graphic, the next day on Facebook, I was using Google to find them, and I downloaded this picture. The next day, Facebook sent me a sponsored ad from the Wall Street Journal about Chilean wines. So there you go. Modern tech. Chile paradoxically is isolated despite its 2,000 miles of Pacific coast. Chile's only communications with Madrid, with Spain, during the colonial period involved first a voyage from Chile to Lima, Peru, then a second leg from Lima, Peru to Panama, and then offloading whatever cargo was being shipped, including letters as well as silver, a harrowing journey on mule over the forest-clad mountains of the Panama Isthmus. And it was also very dangerous. Mosquitoes, yellow fever. Once it was loaded back on another ship on the Caribbean side of Panama, then there was a third voyage through the Caribbean and a layover in Havana to wait for the Silver Fleet, the famous Silver Fleet, which sailed once a year to Spain. So, from Chile to Lima, Peru, from Lima, Peru to Panama, offload, mules, backpacking across Panama, reload, sail to Havana, wait for the annual Silver Fleet to sail together to Spain. That took about a year. And by the time you could expect a return trip, it'd be 2 years. That's the essence of colonial mercantilism. So here's a picture. You see Chile to Lima, Lima to Panama, a mule train across Panama, then to Havana, then to Sevilla. Rather complicated. The indigenous population was very small in Chile, which of course, between the presence of indigenous peoples and the economic activity of sugar production and Atlantic slavery, those two factors pretty much mixed with European immigration have determined the demographic composition of any particular country in Latin America. Chile did not have large concentrations of Indian populations, as did Peru in the case of the Incas, and Bolivia. And the indigenous groups that were in Chile were warlike and migratory hunter-gatherers, something like the Old West of the United States, the Comanche or the Cherokee. Similar to the Plains Indians, the Chile did not manage to subdue their fierce resistance until quite late in the 19th century. Chileans did not mix with indigenous peoples as much as did nearby Peru and Bolivia, somewhat reducing the foundational traumas experienced elsewhere in Latin America and partially simplifying the nation-building process. So, if you read the textbook Born in Blood and Fire by John Chastain, you know that his theory is that a lot of Latin America's problems can be traced back to foundational traumas, violence, disease, genocide, and Chile experienced a very minimal amount of that in the colonial period. And again, the indigenous of Chile still celebrate their traditions and their folkloric ways today. So the historical time period in which the House of Spirits is set, the Chilean historical time period, it takes place through most of the first part of the 20th century. Unlike Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which covers 7 generations, from the early 1800s through the middle of the 20th century, the House of Spirits covers 4 generations of the Trueba family, beginning shortly before World War I and concluding in the 1970s after the Chilean military coup of 1972. Both books incorporate elements from their respective countries' histories, although Allende does so more directly and explicitly. The Chilean political parties through the 20th century, there were basically 4 groups: the Socialist Party, the Christian Democratic Party, which was indirectly supported by the Catholic Church and was often center-right but occasionally embraced populist causes, and the Radical Party and the Frente Popular, which were led by General Carlos Ibáñez who became the president of Chile in 1927 and again in 1952. Those two groups were more populist. The right wing, or the Conservative Party, remained locked into a conservative ideological mindset from before the 1920s to at least 1960 that expressed itself as the right to vote is not a natural right. The right-wing Conservative Party represented the oligarchy, the wealthy landowners, which you will see in the book The House of Spirits. This mindset is clearly illustrated in The House of Spirits by Enrique Trueba, who does everything in his power to rig the elections in favor of the Conservative Party throughout his entire life. Neocolonialism. No, this is a mistaken slide. I forgot to delete this. Sorry. Yep, another one. Salvador Allende. The socialists began to build up a solid electoral base in 1941. Initially, the Socialist Party was overtly populist in its origins, and initially defined El Pueblo as the social base of the party. In 1970, a lifelong socialist and a medical physician, a doctor, Salvador Allende, was elected president in a narrow runoff election after having previously run for president unsuccessfully 3 times. He immediately undertook some very serious reforms of the Chilean economy. He nationalized several industries owned by foreign investors in the United States, and he attempted to expand education and improve the living standards of the working class. These steps threatened right-wing parties that controlled Congress, who then proceeded to encourage the military to overthrow Allende. I found some pictures of Allende with Fidel Castro, and I wanted to post those. That was probably a big no-no, and probably encouraged the United States and the CIA to see him as a threat, even though he was a socialist, not a revolutionary Leninist. Something similar happened in Brazil when João Goulart visited the People's Republic of China, and then was eventually overthrown by a military dictatorship. During the 20th century, most countries in Latin America were obligated to make a painful transition from elite oligarchy to popular democracies. Brazil made that transition in 1930. Mexico went through a very violent transition, as we've already seen, from 1910 through 1930. Argentina in the 1920s up through 1945 with Juan Domingo Perón, and Peru in the early 1930s. Although a few of them were successful, nearly all of them went through recurring stages of military authoritarianism along the way. Most of the populist movements were associated in one way or another with the rise of mass media, radio in particular, and global economic depression. In 1972, the Chilean military launched a coup against Allende with collaboration from the CIA. The senators and congressional leaders who encouraged the coup were shocked when the military dissolved Congress and took over the government for themselves, beginning a 20-year military dictatorship. They wanted the military to come in and clean up a mess for them and then hand them back the reins of power. And you'll see this in the book when Enrique Trueba tries to rescue his granddaughter, who's been taken prisoner and is being tortured. He's shocked when his name carries no weight because he's an important senator and an important member of the Conservative Party, but they let loose a tiger and it got away from them. There's a good deal of evidence that the Nixon administration in particular was complicit in the rise of the military security state in Chile and other countries in the Southern Cone, with encouragement especially from Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. During the coup of the presidential palace was bombed, allegedly by the CIA pilots. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Bay of Pigs, Guatemala City in 1954. The presidential palace was surrounded by the military, and the CIA flew bombing raids. Salvador Allende died in the palace, ostensibly by suicide, although there are those who believe that his suicide was fabricated to cover up a military execution. Then began a reign of terror that cost the lives of an estimated 3,000 civilians who were killed, disappeared, and tortured just within days after this coup. The death toll was much higher over the 20-year period, but in the immediate aftermath of the coup, at least 3,000 people were rounded up, tortured, killed, and disappeared. And here are some pictures. Up in the upper left, you see demonstrations in favor of Allende. In the lower left, you see Allende coming out of his palace and looking up at the airplanes that were bombing the palace with his guards. And then on the right, you see a picture of the military surrounding the presidential palace. This is 1972. I was 21 at the time, so I remember this well. And enters the bad guy, General Augusto Pinochet. General Pinochet was one of the primary military leaders in organizing the coup, and later became the military strongman who ran Chile from 1972 until the return to democracy in 1990. This is a significant departure from things you may have read about the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes such as existed in Brazil and Argentina, Uruguay. They were military security states, but they tended to be run by the military with rotating members of the upper echelons of the military rotating in and out of the presidential office, generals, colonels. This was particularly true in Brazil from 1964 through 1985. Scholars have termed that a military authoritarian regime to distinguish it from charismatic or populist regimes led by a caudillo. In the case of Chile, it was more like a caudillo approach because General Pinochet took power and never shared it with other members of his military. He became I don't want to make light or tell jokes. He became the supreme ruler and a source of terror. In addition to the body count of over 3,000 executions and disappearance in the immediate violent military coup, Pinochet presided over a reign of terror that saw as many as 80,000 people interned and the torture of tens of thousands, including pursuing important people from the Chilean government or the Chilean culture into other countries. This is a picture of when he was older. Pinochet pursued his enemies into other countries and sponsored assassinations of his opponents in Rome, Washington, D.C., and Buenos Aires, and several other locations that I didn't put down. Orlando Letelier was probably the most famous. He was a journalist who fled to the United States, and Pinochet's men tracked him down in Washington, D.C. and blew up his car. He died in a car bomb. Eduardo Frei Montalva was a former president of Chile, and he was poisoned. Also, Pablo Neruda, the poet laureate of Chile and a winner of the Nobel Prize, it's suspected that he was poisoned just days before he left on a trip to Mexico to denounce the Chilean regime. So his victims included members of the Socialist Party, at least 2 U.S. journalists, 1 Catholic priest who was beaten to death on a Chilean Navy ship. Crimes against humanity. There's a picture of Orlando Letelier and his car destroyed in a car bomb in Washington, D.C. That's kind of brazen. There's Pablo Neruda. In the book House of Spirits, you'll see references in the second half of the book to the poet, and it's a references to Pablo Neruda. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1971. In 1972 came the military coup led by Pinochet. In 1973, he died of suspected poisoning as he prepared to fly to Mexico to denounce Pinochet. Victor Jarrah was another important cultural figure in Chile. He was a Chilean folk singer. He was brutally beaten and tortured before being shot in the head execution style after his hands and ribs were broken his torturers mocked him and told him to play the guitar. He couldn't play the guitar because of his hands, but he began singing Venceremos, We Will Win, which was a song of the popular unity movement. In the book, his character is represented by Pedro III Garcia, son of Pedro II Garcia. And in the film, that Pedro III Garcia is played by Antonio Banderas. In the book, Pedro III Garcia becomes the lover of Blanca, the daughter of Enrique Trueba, and in one particular moment when her father is enraged, Enrique Trueba is enraged and attacks Victor Jarrah, attempts to kill him, but inadvertently cuts off one or two fingers of one of his hands when he raises his hand up to try to protect himself. So I hope you get a chance to watch the film. Antonio Banderas does a good job of playing that. The real character that Pedro III Garcia is based on was Victor Jarrah, and he died, I think, in the amphitheater, the soccer stadium, where they rounded up the detainees after the military coup. A heroic man. Operation Condor, known as Operación Condor, was a United States-backed campaign of political repression and state terror involving intelligence operations and assassination of opponents. Officially and formally implemented in November 1975 by the right-wing dictatorships of the southern cone of South America, with key encouragement and support by Pinochet's Chile. It actually began even earlier informally with the military coup in 1964 in Brazil. And so Condor's key members were the governments in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. Some estimates are that over the years that Operation Condor was in effect, there were 60,000 deaths across those various countries. There was a U.S. military base in Panama where the CIA and the U.S. military coordinated the repression with the South American governments and provided training and torture techniques. This is documented history. It's not disputed. I get a sense of heaviness when I'm talking about this. I'm sorry about that. The Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and the Reagan administrations were all complicit. I've heard some places that Carter tried to mitigate it or denounce some aspects of it for human rights abuses, but I'm not a student of this area, and so I can't say that for sure. Such support by these administrations were frequently rooted through the CIA. When we have a chance to talk more, I want to talk about my Clint Eastwood theory of history, about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how to try to embrace all of it, and how to love one's country, at the same time not turn away or shut your eyes or ignore both the bad and the ugly that has been perpetuated in the name of democracy. It's not an easy balance to maintain. Alba Trueba in the book is Enrique Trueba's granddaughter. She's the daughter of Blanca Trueba and Pedro III Garcia, played by Antonio Banderas. She is the biographical representation of Isabel Allende in the book. So there's a picture of Winona Ryder, who plays the role in the movie, the film House of Spirits. And below on the right, you see a picture of Isabel Allende when she was younger. Like Alba Trueba, Isabel Allende was clandestinely helping get people out of danger and out of the country until her own life became threatened. And that's when she fled to Venezuela. And of course, that brings us full circle to the letter to her grandfather that she sat down and began to write in 1982, I think it was. which turned into this magnificent book, The House of Spirits. Of all the books we've read thus far, this is the one I think that has the most substantial historical implications. And we'll talk more about that next week when we go into an analysis of The House of Spirits. But she starts, I will say Isabel Allende starts out with a lot of magical realism, but progressively through the course of the book, the magical realism begins to drop away, and it becomes more and more historical realism about the awful conditions and the awful things that happened in Chile during that time period. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you enjoy the book House of Spirits.